hear from everybody about their case studies and get started in a good way. Bonjour, Ani, Cheyenne McKay, Indigenous. My name is Cheyenne McKay. I'm a third generational residential school survivor. I'm also a mother and a co-executive director with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. And I'm also a member of the Council of Advisors for the Canadian Climate Institute, and I have been for the past 6 years. And I've also been a part of the Indigenous Perspective case studies as a mentor for the last 6 years. I'm originally from Minnegozibi, Anishinaabe, Pine Creek First Nation, Treaty 2 and 4 territory in Manitoba. I'm Anishinaabe. I just want to tell you a bit about CIER. CIER is a national Indigenous directed environmental nonprofit charitable organization. We've been around for 30 years. We serve to support First Nation, Métis, and Inuit across Canada build their environmental capacity, whether that be skills, education, training, mentorship, on a variety of different environmental portfolios. I've been with CIER myself for over 16 years and recently appointed to my position last October. I'm joined today by Grace Donnelly. She's our Climate Change Research Associate and member of the Hiawatha First Nation living in Ottawa. She specializes in community-led solutions and youth engagement and youth work. Grace has also been really instrumental in supporting the case study authors with reviewing case studies and providing advice and support and guidance throughout these last few months. So Grace, if you want to take yourself off camera and give a wave. So we're going to start in a good way with a prayer. I'm not an elder or a knowledge holder, but I consider myself to be gaining wisdom over the many years and ceremonies and culture that I walk in. I'm also almost 25 years sober from drugs, alcohol, and I really pride myself in that and following the red road. So I just want to open up with a prayer for us today. So Creator, thank you for this beautiful day and aligning things in our lives for us to be here together. We offer gratitude for the sun, the moon, the stars, the water, fire, land, and spirit. Please continue to look after the people and show and share guidance and wisdom through your helpers. We pray the teachings today reach far and wide and impact positive environmental change. We pray for those suffering from flood damages and displacement, and we'd like to take a moment of silence for them so that they know that there is hope, there is power in collective prayer. So we'll have a one minute of silence. To start off our gathering, I'd like to sing a buffalo song this year. In our Ojibwe culture, the buffalo represents respect. It's one of our sacred laws. This song is to honor the return of the buffalo to many Indigenous communities across Canada. The buffalo are a keystone species, and they are known to be able to affect change and the lands and the waters that they live on. So returning is a way of regeneration and rejuvenation. It's also a reminder to respect for ourselves and each other as the lands and waters we call home, and we need to share the lands and the waters with each other, especially when we're talking about climate policy and we're talking about these policy implications. And it's not just us that are affected, it's also our brothers and our sisters and the ones that fly, the ones that crawl, the ones that, we call bugs. And actually the word for bug is, it's actually a tiny god, because everything in this life is important. With that, I want to sing a buffalo song to honor the bison. Buffalo medicine's calling. Buffalo medicine's calling. Buffalo medicine's calling. Miigwech, that's the buffalo medicine song that was taught to me. So feel free to share that song with anyone you like, especially if you need to be reminded of that core sacred law of respect. So our partner for this case studies are the Climate Institute, is a partner of the program, and we want to thank Van City for sponsoring this year's case study program. If you're just joining us, I'm having people put where they're from and what their favorite summer activity is to do in the chat box. And I'd like to welcome Dale Bugen, Executive Vice President, to say a few words from the Canadian Climate Institute.
Thanks so much, Cheyenne. Really appreciate that fantastic opening, and your partnership continues to be amazing. Like Cheyenne says, my name is Dale Bugen. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Canadian Climate Institute. CCI is Canada's leading climate policy research organization. We've got staff all across the country. I am coming to you today from traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, now known as Ottawa, traditionally a meeting place for lots of Indigenous peoples. And that's entirely appropriate today as we convene together to talk through the latest contributions of Indigenous-led case studies, Indigenous Perspectives. We've been doing this program since almost the beginning of CCI's existence for the last 6 years. It's been a hugely impactful, hugely important piece of work for us. We recognize that sound climate policy needs Indigenous participation, needs to recognize Indigenous self-determination, and that Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing have to really be embedded in the climate policy research and climate policy recommendations that we bring forward and have the privilege to bring forward to governments. So to help deliver that, we know that Indigenous voices have to be leading this work, and that really is the purpose of these Indigenous perspectives. The idea is to amplify Indigenous voices and research and ideas to make climate policy stronger, to make the conversation in Canada around climate policy stronger and more effective and more inclusive as we move forward. So Cheyenne has been a partner with us in the beginning. We really appreciate her and Grace and CIER being such fabulous partners. Thank you. Also want to thank some Institute staff who have contributed in various parts of this. Maria Schaller, who leads our Indigenous Research Program for sure. Dean, Jayla, Carlin, research team members, Nayantara, Kate, Vivian, and Kathleen. Some of you are here on the call. If you are, flick your camera on and say hi. But we thank you for your contributions. Thanks most of all to the panelists and the case study authors. You are really the main drivers of what we're here to talk about today. We hugely value what you're bringing and what you're sharing with us. So thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for engaging and for being part of this program with us today. Cheyenne, I think I'll throw it back to you and then we can get into business.
Sounds great. No, we welcome Connor Kerr and Tara Marsden. If you could just do a wave, we're gonna hear from you guys in a bit about your case studies. Just a few housekeeping that we are recording this session, and also if you have an AI recorder, we ask that you turn that off to not disturb the panelists or as we're having our discussion. We'll be asking the authors some questions after they've shared their case studies. There will be also some dedicated time for some live Q&A at the end of the discussion. If we're not able to get to your questions, we will be following up with emails to be able to get those answers to you. We welcome and encourage respectful questions from the audience, and we encourage you to type the questions in the chat box. And following the session, this event will be shared with all registered participants. So we'll begin by having each panel member introduce themselves and briefly share what their case study is about. Connor, will you please start us off in a good way of sharing your work?
Thank you, Cheyenne, and thank you for the beautiful song as well. It's so nice to be constantly reminded of the bides and restoration work and what we can do to bring back those animals to these landscapes again as well. I want to have everyone start thinking about what it would be like to wake up at 4 a.m. on a cold October morning The smell of coffee is coming out of an urn in the back room of an old kind of cabin off of Buffalo Pound Lake. You have your grandfather frying up some bacon and a couple eggs. You go out, you go in the truck, you load the dogs up, and you drive out to a field under the northern lights. And the northern lights are singing away, while under those, you set up a whole bunch of duck decoys and a marshy little slough on the Canadian prairie, just south of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, in an area called the Haunted Hills. And in that lake or by that slough, you sit there in the darkness and you wait and you watch as the dogs snore around you, as you drink the coffee, as you feel the warmth of it, and you see the whispers of the fog coming off of it, going up into the night sky. You sit there in the darkness and you think and you wait. And just before dawn cracks on the eastern horizon, you start hearing the whistling of wings. The first thing you ever hear in the morning is the whistle. Before you can ever see the duck, you can hear the whistle of the wings as they start moving overhead. Long before the geese are moving or flying, long before any of the other birds are waking up, the ducks are singing or whistling by with their wings in the darkness. And you hear that. And you hear that every single year for year after year after year. You sit there in the morning beside your grandfather, and then after he passes, your father, and you sit there with your cousins and you sit there with your family. And as you wait for that crack of dawn, that orange, pink, purple coming up out of the eastern horizon, you hear that whistling of wing on those cold October mornings. And then one year you just don't. The whistling of wings doesn't happen. You don't get that same whistle. And then the next year you go back and you chat with your cousins, and your cousins say that the whistling happened 3 weeks ago, that it happened in the beginning of September this year, not in the middle of October. And then next year it's more into November when this happens. And you can kind of start seeing the disruption of this happening, and you're not sure now. You're starting to think, when do we go bird hunting? When do we go down to the southern Saskatchewan prairies that we've known forever to kind of sit there and listen to those whistling wings of the ducks in the early morning again? Tanse everyone, my name is Connor Kerr. I'm a Métis Ukrainian writer based out of Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. I also realized that I forgot to start my timer, so we'll see how close to 10 minutes I get. So feel free to interrupt me. I am a writer, and I worked in Indigenous engagement and education for a long time before that. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. My grandmother, who raised me, is a very proud Métis woman who comes from the Road Allowances, kind of north of St. Paul, Alberta, but initially was in the Edmonton area. Her family was in the Edmonton area. Edmonton's been my home for a long time, though I grew up in southern Saskatchewan as my grandparents worked for the military out of the air base in Moose Jaw. I've wrote a few novels. I'm just coming into nonfiction work at this point, and poetry books. Some of my novels being Prairie Edge, a book about stealing bison from Elk Island National Park and then releasing them into the Edmonton River Valley as a form of looking at restoring matriarchal governance and putting land back initiatives into action. I've also wrote a couple other books called An Explosion of Feathers, Beaver Hills Forever, Old Gods, and Avenue of Champions, and a future novel called Duck Blind that'll be coming out right away. I love spending my summers hanging out with my dogs and fly fishing, though the water levels in Edmonton are historically high right now with the deluge of rains that we've had over the last little bit. But it's beautiful being on Treaty 6 territory in these homelands here, and I feel very honored to have spent the vast majority of my life here and to continue to spend the vast majority of my life here as well, and to keep learning from the landscapes around us. I grew up with my grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, and my grandmother was the Connor McDavid of harvesting Saskatoon berries. If she got into a bush, she'd be coming out of there with the points lead every single time. The 4-liter ice cream, empty Neapolitan ice cream pail would be filled to the brim with Saskatoon berries. As soon as she looked at a bush, the Saskatoons would immediately jump into her pail. She was so talented at picking berries. It was on another level. And she picked them every year. She lived in the bush north of St. Paul for a long time with her family, and then moved back to the city of Edmonton when she was a young woman. And she learned from her grandmother, a lady named Lizette Desjardins, who was born on the Papas Chase Cree Nation, about the roots in the Edmonton River Valley and about the berry picking areas and where to get Saskatoons, along which stretch of the North Saskatchewan, and what area was best for harvesting fiddleheads and what area was best for harvesting wild mint and other areas to get your berries throughout the year. And even as Edmonton became a major city, she still knew these routes and knew these spaces and knew where to go within this within. And she would go from her apartment on the north side of Edmonton and she'd take the bus down south and she'd hop out at the river valley with her 4 liter ice cream pails and she'd wander the same trails and the same bushes and the same spaces that she had wandered for her entire life and that her mother had wandered for her life and that her grandmother had wandered for her life, and back on and on and on for generations and generations and generations, harvesting these berries, harvesting Saskatoon berries. I and and then the years, things started changing as well. She would kind of have her time when she would go down and harvest these berries, and it was set up within these cycles of what was kind of happening in these spaces. But then one year would be a little bit different. The next year would be a little bit different off of that. There would be changes to the cycles of berries. Some years there wouldn't be any berries whatsoever. Some there would be tons of berries. Everything kind of was shifting and shifting in a way that she wasn't used to, in ways that you never actually heard before or saw before, and ways that came in different spaces than had happened. The pattern that her knowledge was built on, the pattern that told you when to get on the bus and where to walk and what bushes to start with, it started becoming unreliable. Her knowledge around picking berries and her knowledge around that still existed, but the conditions that was built on were shifting underneath. When I grew up hunting, I grew up harvesting, I grew up fishing. It was something that was very important to me. But as a young man, I lost access and my ability to do so. I no longer had the same financial privilege to be able to go out harvesting and go out hunting. As a kid living in the middle of Edmonton, I didn't have a car for a long time. I didn't have money for the gas that a car would take. I didn't have the knowledge even of where to go in this moment. The knowledge that I had was based around southern Saskatchewan when it came to bird hunting and moose hunting. And I knew where to go picking berries with my grandmother, but I didn't know where to go to do these other things. And I fortunately won a poetry award when I was in my last year of university. And with that money, I purchased a aluminum canoe and a shotgun, and originally got a job working with Paul First Nation, where I was able to buy a 1998 blue Chevy Lumina. And I started being able to go out on the land and start doing the bird hunting that I'd done when I was a child, and getting back into those spaces and learning from being able to do that. But the access that it took was it took a lot to be able to create the conditions that allowed for me to be able to access the land again. It took a lot of privilege. It took a lot of being able to go through university to get the funds and the ability to begin to access these spaces and these lands again from where I'd initially been disrupted from. And there's a lot of inherent prejudice and bias that goes behind a lot of those kind of things, and speaks to the idea that, Métis and First Nations and peoples have just an inherent access to the ability to get on the land and be able to harvest and practice these kind of in these spaces. Access that you might not necessarily have access as growing up in an urban kind of direction too. And then when accessing the land as well, we often see this created racism that kind of happens in these spaces where there's an administrative barrier for Métis harvesting that exists. There are societal barriers that happen around Métis harvesting. Even this past weekend, I was out at Muskegee Lake, which is just by Small Boy Camp in the foothills of Alberta. And my friend and I we were fly fishing on the lake for cutthroat trout, and we ran into a couple old boys, not from Small Boy, but from Hinton. And the first thing they did when they introduced themselves was tell us an incredibly racist story about the Small Boy camp. People basically just like decimating that lake and taking all the like cutthroat and all the fish and everything out of it on a regular basis. And I remember just thinking to them, like at this moment, this happened last Friday, like this isn't true. Like you are completely lying to us right now. This is so false. And everything you're saying, you've heard this as a rumor that like you're just passing on and on and on and on when you're around here. And there's this inherent racism, these systemic barriers that are being kind of put into these spaces as well when it comes to the harvesting that exists there too. A lot of this was kind of talked about in my case study over the last little bit, including some more stories around the access to the land and the points of disruption that happen to Métis peoples in these spaces, but also happen to Indigenous peoples in general too. And I want to end my kind of little talk by thinking about a little bit about what it means to break down some of these administrative barriers that exist here and what it means to also look at transforming Indigenous knowledge systems so that it's not just a footnote onto an already existing report, but something that's built into the design and structure that exists beforehand. Hi, Kinanasklinton. Thank you for having me here, and it's been a privilege to work on this case study with you all.
Thank you, Connor. And I'd like to invite Tara to introduce yourself and about your case study.
I'm a Hihlu if you're in the West Coast. I'm a Galen Silksa if you're in the East Coast. Tara Marsden, Nakinkwe, Wilps Kamlachelt, Winsawit, Lachanedo Pategi. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. My name is Tara Marsden. My Gitsan name is Nakink. I'm from Wilp Kamlachelt of the Frog Clan. Doik Sitnism, I thank you all to our hosts and to the participants for joining and your interest in our case study. I'm here today on behalf of my Wilp Kamlachelt, and Wilp Warachayet, two of the Gitniau Wilp or house groups who have developed the Gitniau climate test. In the community and territory where I'm from, in the Skeena watershed, close to the west coast of what's called British Columbia, climate has already changed. It's not an abstract, hypothetical, or something far off in the future, but a reality that we're already living with. We are a salmon people. Our culture, our language, our food security, our economy, and our spiritual and mental well-being rely to a large degree on healthy salmon populations. In turn, salmon rely on fresh, clean water in our territory. This requires shade in the form of trees, runoff from snowpack into the summer months, and the slow release of glacial melt when that snow is not abundant. Salmon also rely on cool and abundant groundwater, something which we know little about in terms of quantity and precise locations within our territory. Salmon rely on rivers, streams, and lakes with minimal erosion and sediment release. And outside of our territory, salmon rely on cold and unpolluted ocean waters. All of these needs that salmon have are impacted already currently by climate change in the form of drought, reduced snowpack, predicted glacial decline and loss, erosion from catastrophic wildfire, and ocean acidification. This is compounded by the more direct impacts to salmon from industrial megaprojects, which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions as well, driving that climate change, specifically fossil fuel pipelines, terminals, and the overall development of the fossil fuel industry. Our connection to salmon is one of the main motivators for the creation of the Gitniau climate test. I was born and raised in our territories, as well as the coastal territories of the Tsimshian people near Prince Rupert and in Prince Rupert. I was raised on salmon, worked in the commercial salmon fishing industry as a young adult, and this fundamentally has shaped how I view development. I learned how to preserve salmon in the smokehouse with my jeets, my grandma, and watched my father set his net on the Skeena River near Gitsigukla. Later, as a young adult, I worked in the fishing cannery in Prince Rupert, a time when almost the entire city, and at that time was close to 20,000, which is now about half that, was sustained from the commercial fishing industry. A time which is now a distant memory as the boom and bust cycle of development played out and our fishing industry all but collapsed. I also worked as a fishing monitor, going out on the boats and counting the total number of each salmon species, having to tell the differences between coho and chinook and spring, steelhead, filling out forms, providing data that would inform fishing policy and catch allocation. What I learned, though, and what really spurred me on to complete my master's degree in political science, was that all the data we collected, it did not prevent the catastrophic decline of salmon stocks in the Skeena River watershed, and other major salmon watersheds. So what was the missing link, and what can we learn from the mistakes of the past? What I believe was missing was the connection between data or evidence and decision making. One of my dear colleagues and friends, Jesse Stoppler, has said that we are living in a time of decision-based evidence making, as opposed to evidence-based decision making, where major political and economic decisions are made without supporting scientific and cultural evidence, but rather that evidence is being produced to suit the decisions being made which affect us all. Myself and many other Gitniao do not want to see a future for our children and our grandchildren that is fundamentally different from our childhoods and the legacy our ancestors left us, meaning an abundance of salmon, fresh water, and thriving ecosystems supporting salmon. In combination with climate change, our territory is being claimed by colonial governments who have never rightfully assumed title and jurisdiction through a treaty, land transfer, or other settlement of land title. Colonial governments create laws in the form of environmental assessment, permitting, and more recently, fast-track legislation, which removes environmental oversight that impinge on our territory and on our right to self-govern. While I and many others have participated in colonial processes such as environmental assessment, it is always with a lack of choice. If we do not participate, government will say, well, they were offered the chance and they didn't choose to. If we do participate, the most we can hope for is to secure some mitigations on paper. But what we've seen is the majority of those mitigations are not followed through on, and the enforcement is significantly diminished in terms of colonial enforcement of environmental mitigations. Colonial processes are not about free, prior, and informed consent, as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous participation is about fulfilling the minimal legal obligation known as the duty to consult. Indigenous laws, whether ancestral and ancient or modern and contemporary, can and do fill a wide gap in sustainability and stewardship. The climate test that I helped develop for Gitniao is a modern tool informed by leading Western science and the ancestral principle of Gwelch'enst. Gwelch'enst is the right and the responsibility to pass on our territory in a sustainable manner from one generation to the next. Gwelch'enst, as told by one of our chiefs, is that if I receive a full basket, it's my responsibility to pass on a full basket to my children, to my grandchildren. And that basket is our land. It's our water, it's our salmon, it's our wildlife. In addition to the test itself and applying it to major projects within and affecting our territory, the value of the climate test is the learning that we underwent and are continuing to undergo in implementation. No government is perfect. Bringing humility to the process, learning and adapting as we go is crucial. Doik Sitnism, I thank you all, and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Tara. We're going to move on to our more focused questions. So the first question I have is for Connor. Connor, your case study discusses various challenges that Métis harvesters are facing today, such as harassment, licensing barriers, and climate change. What policy and governance changes are needed to better support Métis harvesters?
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Tara, as well. I want to kind of go back to that story I was talking a little bit earlier about the initial launch into some racism from these just random people who are at this lake fishing in very much like the indigenous kind of territories. And that's not an isolated incident by any means. That's a common kind of thread that follows, as everyone knows, social media discourse, forums, message boards, common thoughts, stereotyping. If there's ever, cases of poaching or things like that, the initial kind of assessment by non-Indigenous harvesters is to blame the Indigenous peoples kind of in the area. If the moose population is low, the Indigenous peoples get blamed. The fish are low in the lake, the Indigenous peoples get blamed. It's kind of a constant system that goes that way, and it's an ongoing one that just is continually looked at from just the Western eyes as fine and okay. And we see that playing out with when it goes to even as far as murder, which happened in Alberta a few years back, as referenced in the in my case study with Sampson and Morris and what they faced when they came up to gain some racism in their harvesting of moose after being laid off and looking to fill their freezers for their family and their community. And the RCMP wrote that one out as a isolated incident. But for most Indigenous harvesters and people who exist in these spaces, that's not an isolated incident. That happens on a regular basis. When I was a few years back moose hunting with an elder from Enoch Cree Nation, who I spent a lot of time with in my early 30s and 20s. We had permission quotes, to be on this farmer's land in southeastern Alberta. And the farmer was incredible. We've known the guy forever. He's a great guy. He helps us out a lot. But of course, there are other people in the area. And so when some other people driving one of these back roads saw the two of us out loading a moose into the back of this vehicle, they came in hot and they had their guns ready and they were, "Why are you guys trespassing on this area?" and yelling. And we had to. And thankfully, I think the farmer saw that we were, that these guys had pulled over. So he left his yard and came over to kind of diffuse the situation. But if that wasn't the case, who knows where that would have gone? And as Indigenous kind of harvesters, to just kind of get out of those spaces and diffuse and just to leave. And this is kind of an ongoing it's an ongoing endemic that exists here. And I think that comes back to the idea of what are we doing for education around anti-racism and training within these institutions? How are we working with conservation officers to mitigate these type of things and inform people on the proper ways that are the proper rights that Indigenous peoples have? How are we also, as Indigenous peoples, looking at debunking some of these narratives and spaces, and not to put the onus of work within ourselves, but also to look at the way that we're approaching our own kind of narratives around this too, and the way that we create these kind of spaces going forward. But I think there's a lot of anti-racism education training within these institutions and public spaces that needs to be kind of pushed forward. How is general kind of discourse and culture happening around these kind of things? Are there opportunities for, unfortunately, but like corporations and others, governments, to be able to do more education through their product placement videos and these other things that will highlight the actual Indigenous experience of harvesting? Because in my mind, like, even when in this exact time when my this elder from Enoch and I harvested this moose, and we're getting it loaded up and we've got it quartered and we're putting it in the back of this truck. And the elder says, goes and he tosses it's a 2-year-old bull moose. It's the exact one we're looking for. It's the perfect eating moose. He goes and throws the little tiny paddle antlers kind of into the bush. And I ask him, of course, to say, what are you going to do with those? And he just looks at me. He's like, "You can't eat an antler sandwich," which is always like the ongoing adage when it comes to it. It's about filling the freezer. It's not about trophy hunting or anything like that. I grabbed the antlers because my dogs love chewing on them and getting the nutrients out of it. But I just, with that alone, these guys think we were poaching in these spaces or that, but they don't understand the legal rights that exist here, as well as the harvesting practices that have been passed down for generations and generations that highlight the sustainability that kind of comes on that too.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And also, they use the antlers for making arts and crafts, right? And beaded earrings and such.
I don't think my buddy had much of an arts and crafts kind of background there. So, yeah.
My second question is for Indigenous communities who are working to support food sovereignty and protect harvesting practices, what advice or key considerations would you offer based on your experience?
I want to kind of go back to the idea of when I was kind of relearning how to hunt there. And this comes back into also the accessibility question and those kind of spaces and things that exist there too. We talk a lot about, supporting food sovereignty and continuing to learn from knowledge holders and those who are able to have access to these landscapes and know the way that these systems and these cycles work, and have been adapting within climate change for the last little while. Because for Indigenous peoples who are constantly adapting, and for Métis peoples who have been adapting always, now we're just adapting at a way higher rate than we have in the past to be able to learn these kind of systems and how to navigate them as well. And so I think as we're like moving forward in some of these, we need to be constantly kind of learning and documenting the changes that are happening within communities. And a lot of the reports that the environmental monitoring reports that the Métis settlements and Métis nations in the West are putting forward are great starting spaces, and those exist within, but they often exist to begin with within a Western framework that kind of begins there. And I think that often the Western frameworks that begin the discussions around these reports, and they're kind of situated, once again, kind of treat them as an addendum, as the room being built on the house afterwards, and not being built from the ground up around what these changes actually mean. And so looking at the idea of continuing to build up these food sovereignty and harvesting practices, think about ways that we can put grant funding and access into place for those who don't have access to these to these spaces. And often that comes down to access to land, which sounds ridiculous coming from an Indigenous background where all the land is, to be shared and to be honored. But the access to go into safe spaces to be able to practice this is often something that's very limiting. And there are organizations, including the Treaty Land Sharing Network in Saskatchewan and now in Alberta, that are working with local like landowners and farmers and as means to create more access for Indigenous peoples to be able to practice these kind of spaces. But that's just a small organization doing a little bit of it, and it needs to be more kind of widespread and apparent throughout that these access kind of components are there, but also the grant funding that could be, and education that could be behind the training for people who might not necessarily know these histories and these cultures and these traditions and these methods and these practices, to be able to continue to build that up as they so yeah, I would say a big education, granting, as well as access to land, and working with non-Indigenous peoples on building some of those things, but from an Indigenous design lens from the get-go.
Great, those sound like really viable solutions for this issue. Thank you, Connor. Now, Tara, I have some questions for you. The Gitnao climate test evolved out of dissatisfaction with colonial approaches to evaluating the impacts of major projects. Can you walk us through how the test has evolved over the years and what impact it has had on Gitnao decision-making and self-determination? Does the federal government's latest project to fast-tracking proposals factor into your approach going forward?
Thank you. So the Gitnao climate test really was a part of the WILP sustainability assessment process, which is a First Nation-led or Indigenous-led assessment parallel to Crown processes. And the origin, I would say, was the experience in participating in provincial-led processes that really defined the scope and defined how participation would look, and didn't really reflect our ancestral principles and teachings and our ayok, which is our laws, and really minimized First Nations to similar to a stakeholder, and having that very minimal legal duty to consult be the primary objective, as opposed to consent or reaching consensus or having shared and joint decision making. And so the WILP sustainability assessment process, established in 2020 and piloted for a couple of years to test run on different projects. And part of that, at the beginning, the climate test was a very small line that just said, if a project will cause either the provincial or the federal government to not meet its climate emission reduction targets as outlined in the Paris Agreement, then that project should not proceed. So it's a very simple, straightforward, even recognizing that the Crown in that case with the Paris Agreement had gotten something right, and that we should be looking to that as a standard. But as we started to receive projects and to review them, we found that there was a lot of claims, and these companies come with binders and binders of documents and studies, and it looks all really good and convincing on paper, but we didn't have a framework to analyze those claims, and we didn't have a framework to assess the scientific information that was being presented. And so we enlisted expert support and looked at other tests, similar tests in different jurisdictions, and tried to develop some criteria. How will we assess these claims on climate? If a company is claiming to achieve net zero, what does that mean? What does that look like? And what are the criteria that you should be using to assess the efficacy of those claims, or the effectiveness, or the how well they are substantiated? And so the test includes 13 now, a few years later, includes 13 criteria and sub-criteria, which are simply evaluation questions. So a way to engage with proponents, to get more information, to fill in gaps in understanding and knowledge, and to then assign a scoring. So it is subjective in that way, but the criteria are not subjective. They are gleaned from leading edge Western science on climate. But someone has to say, well, how does this project stack up? So that part of it is a little more subjective, and we've noted that it is one of the things that people should be aware of as a limitation. So in terms of the decision making and self-determination as an expression of IOC, as an expression of our laws, that this is a tool that we can, again, not just be participants in a colonial process, but actually lead our own process and really reflect more of our worldview, as well as upholding science and good standards, like as I mentioned, where government has retreated from those in some cases. And the federal government's latest fast tracking legislation, latest fast tracking approach, the Major Projects Office, and then also in the provincial government is now sort of removing funding from environmental oversight, environmental protection, and monitoring, and reassigning those funds to fast tracking permits. So it's a trend that is definitely a concerning one. And it really undermines the ability for, as I mentioned, if you want to engage in shared decision making, if you want to engage in government to government negotiation or decision making that is more consensus based between two governments or multiple governments, having one government say, well, we're going to do this review in a short amount of time, and we don't really care what that does to the quality of the review. We're going to push ahead because that's what industry wants. Industry wants faster timelines. It really takes away the ability for that government to government relationship. It takes away the ability for meaningful participation of WILT members. So the average person, in our community, their ability to participate is really diminished if things are on this fast track, and things are being sort of shortchanged or undermined or overlooked in that process. And, I think that it's a sign of this sort of capture of our governments by industry, and that governments are not able to exert as much jurisdiction and as much authority to enforce laws and permits and certifications and certificates, environmental certificates, because there is this pressure. And it is largely, external pressure from global economics and tariffs and all of those things. But we also have this global responsibility. And when I look to both the Paris Agreement on climate as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that we have these solutions already. They are the result of global consensus, but we're now just retreating from that consensus, which is really unfortunate, but it's still there. It's still a powerful tool, and it still reflects, the best thinking of humanity on what we call planet Earth. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. My second question, for Indigenous communities who are considering developing and deploying their own impact environmental assessment, what are some key considerations, best practices, or advice that you could offer?
Yeah, so I've worked with a number of other nations who are or in the process of developing sort of modern tools or modern laws that really reflect their ancient teachings or their ancient laws, and they want to carry things forward into the modern era and to use science. These are largely scientifically driven processes and not only reflecting culture, not only reflecting spirituality and the tie to the land. Like that is a part of it, but it's always that balance between science and our culture and our ways of being and knowing. And so I think the advice that I would have, the key considerations, is that it is a investment. It's an investment of time. It's an investment of human resources. It's an investment of sort of our human capacity. And to take that on while you're also responding to all these major projects and fast track and all these things, like that's a lot to bear. And it does cause, things like burnout or just those things that people in small communities and isolated communities struggle with, I would say, in terms of what people call capacity generally is actually the result of these sort of external pressures coming down on us and how we respond meaningfully. But I think when we always go back to those teachings, when we always go back to, and like for us, we always say, Gwelchianst, and we go back to that and we just think, okay, so that means that I'm not, the final decision maker on anything. I came from a line of people who were thinking about me, and I'm in a healthy environment now, or relatively healthy, because of people who thought of me thousands of years ago and who thought, generations into the future. And I'm trying to hold that and carry that forward, and think of those people in the future for my lifetime as well. And so having that humility and having those teachings that are grounded in who you are and how we survived, right? All of our territories are different. When I listen to Connor's stories, I'm just like amazed, and I can really visualize what he's talking about. I've been to the prairies. It's so different than where we live and our communities and our territories, but they're suited to that environment. Like I couldn't survive there, like they're so suited to that environment because they have those decades and millennia of teachings and grounding in the territories. And so drawing on those as your strength, drawing on those as your inspiration, I think is one of the key considerations and takeaways. And to always, try and, if you're feeling small, if you're feeling like, well, do Indigenous people have laws? Like, isn't the Crown like the main decision maker in our territories? That's internalized racism. That's us believing what we've been taught about our societies and our governance when Europeans arrived, that it was inferior, that we were here for, the exploitation and the domination by European people, which has simply been proven wrong so many times. So I think that unpacking that, unlearning that is really a part of having the ability to move forward and say, we're now going to establish modern tools, modern laws that are going to reflect who we are, as well as what the current needs are in terms of impacts, in terms of how to address those impacts in a meaningful way.
Miigwech, thank you. Very, very insightful. I think those are really good recommendations. So the next section, I have a question for you both. So both of your case studies highlight the way colonial systems fail to acknowledge, value, and prioritize Indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing and understanding climate change and its impacts. Can you expand on how you'd like to see that change? Whoever wants to go first.
I can hop in.
Okay.
Yeah, not a problem there. I think a lot of it goes back into addressing the actual just structures that are behind a lot of the frameworks and a lot of the reports and a lot of the methodological like arguments that are happening and being put forward these days. and looking at the way that they're actually intended or what they're intended for and how they're being created and designed, and where are they coming in as just a footnote, as a, yeah, once again, like building another room onto the house, or are they actually building that house from the ground up? Are they actually going in with like the right intent, and understanding the value of Indigenous knowledges and lived experience and histories and traditions, and like the primary data that comes from that too. So think about ways to redesign it so that we can incorporate Métis observational knowledge as primary data, and not just as, you know, the little supplementary commentary that comes in after a lot of the analysis is already done. So really thinking about like how we can build these data collection systems that are coming back to being accountable to communities, whether they're Métis communities, First Nations communities, Inuit communities, all of those across. So thinking about ways that we can move forward into the idea of restructuring when it comes to creating and building out these kind of like these systems here, rather than rather than continuing on in the kind of colonial way that we have in the past.
Thanks. Go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I think I touched on this a little earlier. I'll try and expand a little now in terms of the tools that we already have at our disposal that really, we should be thanking previous generations, and some of those people are still alive today for developing and gifting to us to use. And those two are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That took I think around 36 years of concerted effort at the United Nations to be passed by the General Assembly. And before that, it was decades of work before the United Nations was even formed, when it was called the League of Nations. And that's Indigenous people from around the world coming together, trying to have state governments understand the impact of colonization, trying to create solutions, and to have inherent rights be recognized. And free, prior, informed consent is in there. And that's, a main reason why Canada objected to the UN Declaration being passed in 2007. And free, prior, informed consent is under attack once again in what we call British Columbia. We have the provincial legislation called DRIPA, or the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And that's receiving huge backlash right now from the Conservative Party, from another party called 1BC, and people wanting to repeal this. So again, decades of work trying to have a global consensus on Indigenous rights now being slowly chipped away at and eroded, and governments retreating from their commitments because of this political backlash currently. And a lot of it's around disinformation. A lot of it's around people fearing that they are going to lose their home, their private property, that Aboriginal title, if it's established, will kick people out. And then capitalizing on that fear, and I think I heard Connor use the word scapegoating Indigenous people as the cause of economic decline or all of these problems that society has. And the retreat right now, I think, is the biggest concern, because if you repeal DRIPA, if you undo, all of these decades of work, we're still here. We still have a connection to the land. We still have our rights and our title, and we still have concerns about the way that development is occurring in many places. And so we don't disappear just by repealing DRIPA. The efforts to erase us from our territories have failed time and time again. And the conflict that results when you just disregard consensus, when you just disregard all of that work, is that conflict will continue. And I don't think any of us want to see that. The other one is, of course, the Paris Agreement. Provincial and federal targets have been established. They have been established to say, if we want to keep climate change to a limit as much as we can, if we want to live in a world where we are not being devastated by wildfires and we're not being devastated by droughts and flooding and extreme weather, that we have to cap these emissions, we have to reduce these emissions, and this is how governments can do that. And that those commitments, again, are there. They're the result of global consensus. They're a result of consensus at the time, the best scientific thinking at the time. And now we're witnessing, again, the government of the province and the federal systems retreating from those commitments and saying, well, they're not that realistic. Let's create more realistic targets. But it's really just under this pressure from a fossil fuel industry that has had its way for a very long time and wants to continue to have its way with our lands and resources. And so drawing on those tools, recommitting to them as opposed to retreating from them, I think is the main recommendation that I would bring forward.
Thank you both. We're going to move on to our live Q&A now. I'm just going to get some of these questions. Okay, first question is for Tara. Based on your experience with the Gitnao climate test, what steps should provincial and federal governments take to better support the development and implementation of Indigenous-led impact environmental assessments?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. So in BC, and it's probably not going to be the same in other provinces, but in BC, with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which I mentioned is that provincial legislation to implement and uphold UNDRIP, there is what's called a Section 7. And so there's a clause that says that governments can enter in, or sorry, the provincial government can enter into a consent-based agreement. And so that means that the government can say, well, there's this major project and it's affecting this nation and their territory, and we would like to enter into a consent-based agreement so that that project only proceeds with their consent. It's a very high level part of that legislation. It doesn't go into a lot of detail about what consent agreements must look like. It just says that the government can enter into them. And so where nations have their own Indigenous-led assessments, it's a great opportunity to say, let's tie this into a Section 7 agreement. Section 7 agreements have been rarely used. So DRIPA was passed in 2019. So 7 years later, I think it's still around 3, maybe 2 or 3 that have actually come to fruition in terms of a Section 7 agreement. And those are in like very sort of resource-rich areas where the nation is already actively participating in the development of those resources. And there isn't maybe as much at stake. So if a nation says no, that's usually when the provincial government gets a little worried and concerned about consent. And so I think having that tool be much more accessible, and the federal legislation somewhat mirrors the provincial legislation on UNDRIP, and so having consent-based agreements federally as well is a great tool to help recognize Indigenous-led assessments. And I've seen a lot of different types of agreements over the years where there's a lot of room to still, Canada and BC, they want to maintain their perception of sovereignty, right? Like they want to have people believe that they're in charge. And so, having things that say we have maybe competing sovereignty here, or maybe we're not in agreement on who has title to the land, but we can still try and make a good decision together. We can still access the same data, the same information, and agree on the data. And then the decision, maybe we have areas where we're not in total agreement, but where can we focus in on areas of consensus?
Thank you, Tara. I have a question for you, Connor. You make the argument that Métis harvesting narratives are primary data, not supplementary, to understanding climate change. Can you expand on that? How are Métis harvesting narratives treated by governments and institutions today?
Do you remember like those like Canadian like heritage minutes that would come up on TV back in the day? So I think they're often treated as like the cultural heritage footnote. Like, here's a minute on Métis bison harvesting, and then like they go into some old like stereotypical cartoon stuff. But I think all of them are actually like often created still as like these cultural kind of heritage like footnotes that exist. Like it's often added in like this like it's not built from the get-go. They're not taken with the seriousness that they and the gravity and the levity, or not the levity, sorry, like that they need to be taken with. they're often, yeah, added in as like this like kind of like interesting kind of cultural heritage footnote. Oh, did you know that indigenous peoples like to smudge? Like that kind of like ridiculous like thing that's just like brought out and put in at the end, but they're not actually going into the data that comes in and the transmission of harvesting knowledge that kind of happens around that, and especially as it's used as like an adaptation like strategy as well. Thinking about like trying to all these different narratives and trying to build them out as primary sense like data sources rather than it being seen as like just this kind of like heritage thing. Like thinking about my grandfather and his knowledge of the land, you know, like this was a man who was functionally illiterate. He never couldn't read. He never did anything like that, but he knew exactly how to read the horizon on the prairie to know what kind of weather was happening. He could read the pothouse lows to know what kind of birds were there and when the birds were coming. He had all these kind of like these knowledge systems built in. He knew how to read grouse crops to know what birds were eating. They knew like when the bug harvests or the bugs were hatching, what to right, how the birds were eating them too, and the animals. Like all of this knowledge, it's all part of. It's not created in like and tabulated in some database, but it's inherent. It's built in there, and it's transmitted through actual education experiences on the land. And it can't often be read through a book. You know, it's got to go through the actual practical like experiences to bring that out there. And so for a lot of people who are expecting to kind of just read these narratives or to have these narratives and not actually bring them in is quite, you know, like counterintuitive to the indigenous ways of knowing there too. So, but I think that often, you know, we're looking at the way that we can like co-develop monitoring frameworks with Métis communities directly, and looking at the way that we even approach like data collection systems that are once again accountable to like Métis experience and values, and not just adding it in, yeah, as kind of the cultural heritage footnote at the end of the day.
I think that's a very, very valid point of not being a cultural footnote, and it's kind of similar to not having a report and having communities as the appendix, you know, as the add-on to, yeah. And we've like even in my organization, like we've had lessons learned, and we're learning through the process, or even having different versions of information where there's public-facing information, but there's also information that stays within the community because they want to protect their knowledge and that inherent knowledge, that they want to protect it for the future generations, like those favorite berry picking spots, like those favorite fishing spots, right? That they're wanting to keep that more internal to the community. And I have another question for Tara. Your case study shares a specific examples of the Gitnao climate test being applied to real projects. Can you unpack one of those examples, sharing what the test revealed and how it shaped the outcome or decision that followed?
Sure. So the first one that we applied it to was the Eskay Creek mine. And this was a mine that is outside of the Gitnao territory, but in our neighboring nation's territory, the Tahltan. And the Tahltan had one of those Section 7 agreements that I mentioned. And this was the first time that we had run the WILP sustainability assessment process as well as the climate test. And in this case, you know, I like to highlight that there are good corporate actors, and in this case, the results were relatively positive. And so the mine was going forward with an ambition to reduce its emissions, to be you know, climate friendly, and it had the evidence to back it up in most cases. And so the results from that was that you know, that there wasn't a high degree of concern or changes that were needed to be made, I think, to the project, and that we had the sort of the test drive of the test as well. So to say, okay, this is how we applied it, this is how the company experienced it, participating in it and being evaluated, and giving always that chance for them to go back and forth and discuss the results and to fill in gaps that maybe existed. But I think that, you know, there are other projects that we talk about that didn't have the same results. And I think that it's good to highlight that industry is not all bad, or that people are not against development just because you're concerned about climate, that there's a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot of room for, relationship building and sort of building consensus with both governments and companies to ensure that projects that are being built are as climate friendly as possible.
Thank you. You guys are answering these questions so fast. I have a question for Connor. Storytelling runs throughout your entire case study. Can you share what storytelling means to you personally and why it should be part of the climate change policy conversation?
Ooh, I thought I had a good answer to this, but I don't know if I actually do at this point anymore. I just think like that's okay. No, I do. I remember what my whole point was. Sorry. It's accessibility at the end of the day. It's accessibility to knowledge, to history, to like story, to like to all of this. Like if you're reading, like we've all seen these like government reports that are now look like they're just generated by like Chat GPT or Claude or something like that, where it's like they took every like bureaucrat in the world and got them to create this kind of report, and it's got all the perfect language in it around like we're going to engage in synergies to create like new policy directions and blah blah blah. But the way that actual storytelling happens, like you're having tea with your grandmother, when you're having a coffee with your aunties in the morning, when you're chatting with your family over food, or your friends, or you're just driving around and yapping and talking like that. Like that's when true story comes out. That's when true knowledge sharing comes out. It like it's hard to get that same level from a report and a government like based report at that, or a corporate based report on those kind of things. Like it doesn't come in to the way that we can access knowledge. And even in my writing and my storytelling in general, I try to think of ways that, my 95-year-old Métis grandmother would be able to act. Would she be able to read this and understand what we're saying? Would she be able to learn something from this? Would she be able to contribute to the conversation? Because if she can't, then we're excluding the most important kind of people from the like conversation in general. So we need to make sure that accessibility is so built into the way that we approach storytelling and writing in general, so that the elders and the young ones and the future generations, everyone can kind of like access this at the same point. And I still remember hanging out with this an older Métis lady, an elder who passed away quite a few years ago now. And we were finishing. I had a great job when I was a kid, driving elders around Edmonton, and I'd often go pick them up at the River Cree where they're staying, and then drive them into downtown for their government meetings, and just hang out for the day and chauffeur them around. And so I was driving this Métis lady back to her hotel after a day of government meetings, and she just like looked at me and she was like, did you understand the thing that they were talking about today? And I was like, to be honest, I wasn't really paying too much attention, but I also was just like, no, I didn't. I was like, no, I have no clue. And she's like, yeah, that's a problem. Like, you got this like university educated, like young, like a man, like here in these meetings, and I had no clue what anyone was mentioning or talking about. She's like, that's an absolute problem right there. And she's like, we should make sure that like everyone can access knowledge, whether we're educated from a Western perspective or from an Indigenous like community perspective, or you're an elder or you're a young one as well. So I think it comes down to accessibility with storytelling.
I think that's great, and I completely agree. Like those kind of modes of storytelling and making sure that you pass on to the next generations. But it's also very fluid in the way the information comes together and it's shared. It's like it's captured in like that point in time. I know a lot of people have been like recording storytelling to do the digital storytelling mapping and like trying to entice the younger generation as well. So there's lots of different modes of capturing knowledge and storytelling and embedding it in projects. I think do I have another question? Oh, one more. We do have time for this one more. Does the Gitnao climate test give a pass or fail outcome to a proposed project? If so, are there provisions for the proponent of the project to fix the issues from the test to get a passing grade? Has the Gitnao climate test been put through any court cases as of yet? And if not, do you think this test would support Indigenous communities who may be going through a legal battle against a proponent?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's no, yeah, to my knowledge, there's no pass or fail. The 13 criteria that we outlined in the case study, each of those criteria can be assigned good, poor, or fair, and then we'll just, in the past have just tabulated the total percentage of good, the total percentage of fair, and just to give the full range of um, understanding based on the information provided by the proponent. And yes, there, like I mentioned, and I think my last answer was that there's been opportunity for the proponent to respond, and they usually do. They usually want to provide more information, and then the results are. It isn't about a pass or fail. I don't think. I think it's more about saying these are the criteria that are well established. This is how your project has been assessed. And do you have anything to share? It has not been used in a legal case as of yet, to my knowledge. And I think with any legal action, that evidence is always paramount, right? Like providing evidence of if you're opposed to a project, why? What are your concerns? Have they been addressed, or has the proponent or the government responded to those? And if so, how? But like I mentioned in my opening, that having evidence as sort of the guiding force of decision making is so important, because as Indigenous people, I think we're often felt to believe that things are just going to happen anyways. Like it's just going to go ahead anyway. So we may as well get some benefits from it. We may as well get some money or some jobs or whatever the case may be. And instead of saying, is this project actually in our interests? And how do we decide that? Like, what type of information do we need to decide if a project's in our interests? And so I think having the criteria, the other jurisdictions to look at, the other tests, similar tests, super important. And to simply have a set of questions that can be asked and then verified. How do you verify information as well when you're receiving it is really important. Yeah, and I just wanted to, I know we're almost at time, but I saw a couple questions that I hadn't heard, and they were kind of around like education and about ignorance of Indigenous people and things like that. I wouldn't mind just touching a little bit on it, and sort of how people can, in this age of social media, and the backlash towards Indigenous people, be better educated. And I think, it's so tied to this question of evidence, and this question of good informed decision making is, when you receive something on social media, how good are the critical thinking skills of our young people to say, actually, like, I don't really know about that YouTube influencer. How do I verify if this is AI or not? Like, so media literacy, social media literacy, really important. And just having that critical thinking lens, as opposed to saying, okay, you should believe this, and this about Indigenous people. How can you be a critical thinker? How can you be a critical thinker about Indigenous history and colonial history, as well as scientific knowledge and information that informs the decisions that are being made today? Thank you.
And I think that's a really good point, because I have teenagers that are telling me about they heard this and this about this celebrity, and oh, it's all over social media. But then the celebrity themselves stood up and said, just to clear the record, none of that is true. So that's a good example about teaching our children to verify information that they're receiving, and have that filter to question things, right? To not just go blindly accepting the way things are. And I think I have one more question that's been added. Where do you both find motivation to keep driving ahead in your work in a moment where, as Tara mentioned, we have been backsliding? Who wants to go first?
I can hop in, and so we're not just playing I think Tara's better at playing the waiting game than I am. So I I mentioned my grandmother earlier, and I felt very fortunate to have grown up with such a passionate, proud lady who was so proud to be Métis. There's never any discussion within our household around who you are, where you come from, your family, or anything like that. And I often get asked in events or different things like, So when did you learn you were a Métis? And like I always think that's such an interesting kind of question because like when did you learn you're anything? Like it's not something you wake up and perform or anything like that. So it's who you are and embedded within your sense of being. And my grandmother taught me that at a young age. And I'm very fortunate because a lot of my friends, a lot of my cousins, a lot of my family didn't grow up with the same privilege, the same benefit that came from that. And I think about what future generations what I want their experience to be. You know, I want them to be able to hear those ducklings in the early morning. I want them to be able to walk along the prairie and see the rise of like a sage grouse. I want them to see like sharp tails dancing on their leks. I want them to see, you know, the like a moose rising from a prairie slough with weeds all over their antlers, like in the fall light. Like there's so much beauty within here. And I think that we often, I want everyone to be able to understand their story to these future generations. And so if I'm able to do a little bit of a part of that, and I now do that more through narrative storytelling rather than, administrative work, but I feel that's such a necessary thing to share in a bit of that same privilege that I had when I was a kid.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. I really, just listening to you talk about your grandma, started thinking about my grandma, and definitely one of the people who instilled in me a lot of determination, a strong backbone, no nonsense kind of person, but really grounded in love for our people and for our communities and our territories. And I have two kids, and in our area, we used to get like up to 10 feet of snow every winter, and the kids were out sledding and they're out playing and building snowmen. And in my oldest daughter's lifetime, she's going to be 16 next month. The snow's gotten less and less and less, and so it's just this ice, that forms because it's always melt and freeze, melt and freeze. And she's always commenting, like I can't go out and play and build a snowman anymore, and I can't go sledding, and it's just like we're just watching this happen, and what are we doing about it, right? Like we all have the ability to do something. It might not be as much impact as we want, but I think that we all have a responsibility. And when I look to my kids' future, I think of what's going to happen in their lifetime, in addition to everything that's changed already. Just that loss of the absolute freedom that we had as young people, growing up and being outside and just being in a healthy environment and playing and having snow and having seasons. Now our seasons are completely different. Not living with wildfire smoke, like we had all these luxuries, and we're just saying to our kids, like, sorry, like, too bad. So that's what keeps me motivated is my really tough Jeets, my really tough grandma, and my kids, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are beautiful responses. We're going to move on to, and we thank our audience for those great questions. And if you didn't get your question answered, we'll put up the email that you can send your questions to, and we'll make sure that those get answered for you. Our closing question is, what's one policy shift that you would like to see over the next 5 years to uplift Indigenous rights and leadership? Maybe we'll go with Tara this time first.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I'll repeat myself a tiny bit, but yeah, just recommitting to our climate emission reduction targets, recommitting to scientific-based information and decision making, and recommitting to the recognition of Indigenous rights, including laws where they exist, where laws have been established and revived, that those are recognized, and that they are recognized as a part of the fabric of Canadian society, and that they are not trying to undermine sovereignty, but to strengthen sovereignty in the face of global changes and economic challenges that everyone is dealing with.
Thank you. Connor?
Yeah, I think the one thing that just comes to mind at the top of it is basically like looking at ways that we can put in like funding streams designated for like Métis community harvesting and food sovereignty projects, and not just as one-time grants here and there, but like putting that more into the larger scope of Indigenous programming. treating that as a sustained, dedicated investment, and also looking at the way that they can support intergenerational knowledge transmission, and at the same time also building anti-racism education and training within all these different institutions that we mentioned earlier. I think we often think that, like, climate change is happening within these different silos within these areas, but it's happening across all these different aspects. And so I think we need to look at the way that we're addressing all of them and not just like lumping it into a little one silo over here too.
Hey, those are great responses. Well, we're going to move into our closing for the session. We asked the authors, the people working in the background, to turn on their cameras. We just want to thank the authors for all your hard work putting together these case studies. We've mailed a Indigenous gift box as a thank you. You mentioned that you received them and you had those snacks already, so that's great. And I also received mine, so thank you, Climate Institute. To honor your work and time, thanks for everyone for sharing the event and for joining. We had such a good turnout. A reminder that the session is being recorded, so please keep an eye out for that and share it out to get this information out there. It's really imperative that we hold each other up and we share Indigenous-led climate policy research. This is a huge gap that we're very fortunate that the Climate Institute and this year's sponsor, Van City, have been able to support with. We encourage you to go out and read those case studies if you haven't already, and sign up through any updates through the Indigenous newsletter from the Climate Institute. We'll be sending out a survey to everyone about the roundtable and would appreciate your feedback so we can celebrate what went well and make adjustments to make it even better in the future. A raffle draw for a gift will be made for all those that participate. This event took place during National Indigenous History Month. There's a lot of opportunity this month to listen and learn from Indigenous people on a path of reconciliation. Please get in touch with us if you're interested in Indigenous Perspective case studies this fall. We usually do our launch around October, November to keep out for information. There's a $15,000 stipend that we offer for authors to complete their research, and you are fully supported with our amazing team from Climate Institute and CIER. So we can unmute yourself and say goodbye in your language. We'll close up our meeting for today. In my language, that's Kika Wapamin Minawa, until we see each other again in Ojibwe.
Doik Sitnism, I thank you all. Gapnism, see you all later.
Ken Naskmutin, hi.